Yeah. Hello and welcome to Swarajya Punctuations. Today, our guest is Hari Kiran Vadlamani. He's a social entrepreneur and a man of many hats. The hat he's wearing today, as we talk to him, is as founder of Creative India, Advaita Academy, and Indic Academy. I've known Hari for about 2, 3 years, and I have talked to him about his ideas of soft power before. And I thought we should all talk to him and get a sense of what he means by soft power. As his bio says, his goal right now is the cultural, spiritual, and intellectual renaissance of India. So let's talk to Hari Kiran Vadlamani about soft power. Welcome to the show, Hari. And please let me start off with the questions immediately. Now, the soft power, when we talk about soft power, it's usually private and diffuse, like Coca-Cola or Beethoven. In the talks you have already given on this at other venues where I heard you, like the India Habitat Center and in the Indic Academy, Indic Thoughts Festival in Goa, for example, you seem to want to institutionalize it in some way and channel it. How does that exactly work? I mean, how does, I mean, is it like the Confucius Institutes that China does? But, when you think of it that way, there's some backlash to it recently. Whereas Coca-Cola, Beethoven don't have the same backlash. So can you please explain what you mean?
Thank you, Jaydeep. And thank you for having me discuss about soft power. There is this push and a pull. So what you are saying is that Beethoven is a pull because it is of value to the listener, and therefore, can you institutionalize or can you have a strategy to push soft power? And that seems to be the question a lot of people ask whenever we talk about soft power. In my mind, I look at soft power as actually a word that has been popularized, and I'm looking at soft power more in terms of from an economic point of view and from an artha point of view, rather than from the karma point of view. So the consumer looks at soft power and he enjoys a Beethoven or he enjoys a Carnatic recital. But behind that enjoyment of that experience, there is an economic value chain of somebody who has trained in that particular skill set, an event manager who has put together that concert, somebody who has marketed it, somebody who's designed it. So there's a whole economic value chain to that final experience that the consumer has. So my focus is on the economics of it rather than on the enjoyment of it. Because so far, whatever initiatives that the government has taken is more, in terms of this vague idea and a mushy idea of promoting art and culture. I would treat art and culture like any other resource that a country has. And therefore, in my mind, any push strategy that the country or anybody would adopt would not have any problem and would not have any backlash, because you're only doing it only when there's a consumer. You're not pushing it down somebody's throat, so to speak.
We're all aware of how, for example, the CIA tried to influence, global American soft power through its, fingers in many pies, whether they're art houses or magazines or radio stations, Hollywood even, so on. And, some people might be offended at the idea of state intervention, but I think this is not only acceptable, but normal and has been going on for a long time. In your venture, you speak as a private entrepreneur, of course, but do you see a role for the Indian state in terms of its policies or encouragement or anything else? And I mean, I guess one question, given the Indian political scene, I would have is a blunt one, is how, if there is a role for the state, how will a change in the power at the center, the party in the center, affect anything like this?
Well, definitely there's a need for a role of the state. Uh, Independent of governments might come and go, but there is a need to institutionalize initiatives. So therefore, we look at institutional interventions and individual interventions. So there could be interventions by not-for-profits like Creative India Academy. There could be interventions by individuals. But ultimately, you cannot get away from the fact that only a state intervention has the maximum impact. I mean, just because of Mr. Narendra Modi's initiative on Yoga Day, you had more than 170 countries sign up for that. But that happened because of a push, but there was already a demand there so therefore there was a beautiful match between intervention and the consumer's mind. There's no doubt that state has to intervene, and some of the initiatives that I'm advocating upon would definitely require a state intervention. But if there's a change in the government and the next government does not want to, that's a part of our democracy, and we have to.
The other thing, when we talk about soft power, it seems to me that one of the biggest strengths of, it seems to be there's a chase of a fad many times. For example, having lived abroad for most of my life, I'll say that, there's a sudden interest in Indian cuisine one day, and then the next day, Vietnamese restaurants are popping up all over, that sort of stuff. And one of the examples you used in one of your talks was K-pop. And K-pop was popular, or maybe it's still popular, I'm not sure, a couple of years ago with that Gangnam Style song. But before that, there was something else. So I don't doubt there's an overall benefit of a positive image for the country, and definitely there is a demand, a pull. But given its, sort of response perhaps to these fads, isn't it a little more ephemeral, too ephemeral to institutionalize?
Not really. I understand fads come and go, but there are certain underlying things which are more structural and fundamental, and the form or on which you develop can change. For example, at a point in time, Indian visual artists could be in vogue, and there could be a lot of demand. But if Indian artists are recognized as a core and important contributor to the global art scene, that will not go away. But on the top of it, there could be ups and downs. We have seen that, for example, in Japan. Japan's culture was very much popular in the 1980s, and we had management books, we had the companies, we had the cuisine, and we had a lot of investments into Hollywood. So therefore, that was the flavor of the season. And after that, you could see that there were a change in consumers' tastes. But there's also a structural thing that you must realize. For example, Indian cuisine, we were talking about, there's a structural change in the way British have adapted Indian cuisine into their lives. So that is not going to go away. Curry and Indian cuisine is very much part of their life. And while there could be fashionable things like, you suddenly have an Argentinian restaurant popping up in London, you could have those kind of things. But there is a very structural shift. So you will always have to think of a structural demand that is changing, and then there is a flavor of the season. So I don't think so. There's a permanency, there's an ephemeralness. So therefore, there's a combination of both.
It seems to me that one of the biggest strengths of soft power has to be the home base. India has been, as you know, fighting a rearguard action against the loss of its own culture for decades, if not centuries. And, you look at France or Italy or Germany, these other cultural superpowers. They have universities, art institutes, educational endowments to support their heritage. So, when an American is done with, say, studying the German language in America, he can easily go and immerse himself in a program in a German university and study German culture up close and personal. So, how do you plan to address this painful lacuna in the Indian scene? As much as you push this Indian soft power in terms of art and music and yoga, that next levels, where foreigners can come to India and learn at the source, seems to be weak. So, and this is, perhaps partly also due to a language barrier. And so, you see Alliance Française and you see the Goethe Institute, which promote French and German, for example. In India, I think it's a bit more of a challenge.
Yes, and the fact that we have not invested enough in our art and culture in the last several decades is very much established. So now there are two. So therefore there are really two tracks. One is to invest in our culture in India, and one is to invest it outside. The way I am envisaging that it will pan out is that when we see the success, like for example, yoga is a very good example. When there was an acceptance of yoga globally, you can see a renaissance of yoga and resurgence of interest in yoga within our country. It was not there earlier. So in a way, there is a virtuous loop. There's a virtuous cycle that we enter into when there's a demand externally, and then we supply and meet the demand, and that comes into our country again and strengthens the home base. So, which is like a chicken or egg problem. You can't just say that, look, I want to do this first and then that later. So it's not a sequential kind of a thing. There has to be a parallel pursuit of various initiatives, both domestically and globally. And when you're looking at global success, that global success will in turn encourage Indians to take it up. So then we enter into a virtuous cycle. This is exactly what happened to American culture as they succeeded globally. Domestically also, so it's a cycle, and we should aspire for that.
Do you think that advocating soft power nowadays is a bit of a challenge? For example, I grew up in a time, and in certain circles when it was a virtue to be well schooled in the classics. And, today what we hear is, this talk of selling a culture, which is very different, to other countries or even to the next generation. And, a lot of these projects, it seems like, a bunch of MBAs have gotten hold of the core material and have, turned out into a plan. And, I'm not knocking business, don't get me wrong, but that the sense of virtue about, in knowing about Shakuntala for its own sake, for its own beauty, that seems to have gone. And that might sort of perhaps present a challenge of its own, that you'd have to talk to other countries, other cultures, and a new generation which doesn't seem to share those values that we grew up with.
No, you're very right. I mean, art ultimately, art is from an artist's point of view. Art is just created because he wants to express himself. He doesn't do it or somebody else's appreciation. That's a pure form of art. But there is a sustenance aspect to it, and which is why I keep going back to the economics of art and culture. So what we are really talking about is in terms of, it's a product. And that product, and there's a consumer for that product. But before that, there is a producer and there is somebody who is making it. And this is what we need to not lose sight of when we talk about culture, because culture is an expression or a manifestation of divinity in terms of art and how artist sees his or her work. But before that, there is a sustenance aspect to it. And what we really need to focus, while I am talking about soft power and I'm talking about culture, it's really, I'm talking about the artisans and the artists and all the value chain that is what we need to look at. So look at it as a skill development aspect of what this government is focused on. And then the perspective changes. I just give you an example of Bali. Now, that whole economy is, there is a tourist aspect, there's beautiful culture, and there's beautiful land, beautiful beaches. But eventually, that economy is thriving because the artisans, the artists, and the architects have come together. There's an amalgam, and they have come together. And there is a virtuous loop of how architects bring about contemporary designs, use the traditional grammar, but they give a contemporary form and then infuse it into various villas and other things. So therefore, this is what we need to look at in terms of when we talk about art and culture. There is an external consumption, but before that, there's a production, and we have to keep up with times, and we have to introduce technologies and new ways of producing. And one of the things that I talked about was that one of the smart cities that we need to look at creating is creating a Bali. Why can't you look at creating a Bali, say, for example, south of Goa or someplace, where we invite friends from all over India and create a situation wherein architects come, artists live there, and then you have production facilities where economies of scale are there, and sports. So anybody can fly into Goa and then buy all the requirements. And it's basically we're talking about economies of scale. So if you're looking at larger manufacturing facilities, design, CAD/CAM machines, all these can be provided for at a single location, and then you create this alchemy of sorts. Interestingly, Bali is now an offshore agent for handicrafts for other countries. It's like an offshore place. So the other countries send their designs and get their handicrafts manufactured in European countries. There's a very interesting offshoring model. And so you have to continuously think of it as from an economic point of view. And then only you get into this. Think of globe as a market. Think of Indians around outside of India as your own, in terms of that you need to give them encouragement to set up businesses, which is what I talk about Mudra Global, for example, wherein we look at any Indian entrepreneur anywhere in the world. Like, for example, if he's in Adelaide and he wants to set up a yoga studio or a restaurant, he shouldn't starve for money. He should just go to Macquarie Bank, for example, and you have a tie-up with Macquarie Bank because Macquarie Bank wants to open in India. So you just say, hey, we will do a refinancing. So any Indian who walks into your branch and wants a loan, we'll do the refinancing. So therefore, then what happens is you're not looking at Indians in India as the market and creating entrepreneurs here in India. You're looking at around the world and looking at entrepreneurs around the world. And that's the way to look at it, because then the businesses are, so out of their delivery points, like you have a hub and spoke model. Think of India as a hub, and the delivery points of consumer experience are outside of India. So once you get that kind of a framework in your mind, then we talked about a venture capital fund, for example. The first budget, the government announced a 10,000 crore sovereign fund. I'm not sure what exactly happened to that sovereign fund, but imagine that most of the Indians in Wall Street, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in London, they're all in Silicon Valley. They're all into private equity, venture capital, and in the financial sector. And there are several people who would be interested to do a fund for investing in cultural enterprises as cultural. There's a big trend towards impact investment, social impact investment. So being like environment, right, and social impact. So all the artisans, for example, and their livelihood, it is social impact, right? So if you position it that way and look at it as saying that, look, I'm going to invest in a venture in, say, for example, Pochampalli, and to give them access to technology and give them access to markets globally, and it's a small venture, then you have a specific dedicated fund and you're looking at it. So a fund, financing, these are initiatives that are required, which require some kind of a push by the government. Then automatically the private enterprises will take up.
Now, Creative India Academy is your flagship in this venture. And so, from your description just now, I was wondering, is it in an advisory role or an advocacy role, or, will it only fund, will it help train and do other things to push this aim of furthering Indian culture? Are you, entirely off stage and allowing entrepreneurs to rise and fall on their own merit? Or is there like a mentorship sort of program from Creative India experts, in various fields, not just artisans, but even, from the business management perspective of the sort of business support many artists will need, because they know more about their art than the business model. And, is your target Indians and the Indian diaspora, or people of Indian origin in foreign countries, because they'll be the most receptive, immediately? Or is it, anybody who is interested in promoting Indian culture? For example, I personally know a lot of American and European women who have learned Bharatanatyam, for example, and they, if they want to do something, would you support them as well? Sorry for putting 2-3 questions at the same time, but they're related, and so I thought I would put them together.
Now, you see, this is primarily an advocacy platform on one level, and on the other level, also what we can do within our own initiatives. So there are obviously a thing like Bali, Indian Bali, for example, or smart city is not something that I can do. That's a government. So basically, you make presentations to the government, and it's an advocacy, and the resonance has to be there in the government side. We don't know when it will happen. Maybe it will happen 5 years later, but it's an idea, I think, whose time has come. They've already talked about clusters, and it's not an entirely new idea in terms of the Ministry of Textiles and Handicrafts. They talked about clusters, in Andhra Pradesh and elsewhere. So we're just taking the whole thing and putting it in one location. The things that specifically Creative India Academy wants to do is, one is to set up NICE, which is a network of Indian cultural entrepreneurs, which is a global network. It's a body, which would be membership driven, and any entrepreneur who's involved in making a living out of Indian art and culture, whether he's a member of a yoga studio. So whether he's a restaurant owner, or he's selling Ayurveda products, any person who's involved or who's in a retreat in India and outside, they're all members. This would be like NASSCOM or CII or FICCI, kind of a trade body that would have one voice to advocate to the government. So this is something which is now hands into, at least to try and set it up, and that's the first thing. Second thing is, because I'm in the investment space, I have a network of friends who are angel investors. So what we are trying to do now is trying to get a platform, an online kind of a private platform, wherein we sign up angel investors around the world. And through this platform, all proposals can be reviewed. There's a common due diligence that is done. There's a common contract that is done. and then you circulate it amongst the angels, and then whoever is interested, supposing somebody wants to set up a restaurant somewhere, any venture, then we just circulate that amongst the angel investors, and then people can invest. So that is again something which is in our hand, and we can try and do that. As far as Mudra Global Idea is concerned, again, that is an advocacy thing. We just try to promote this. The most important first step that we want to do is to, about 18 years back, I was mentioning in Goa also that NASSCOM, for example, had a business plan for some Indian IT services sector. And they prepared a comprehensive business plan across verticals, and what exactly should an Indian company do. And this was presented by NASSCOM to the government of that at that time. One idea that we would like to see to fruition is to get McKinsey or any consulting firm to do this on a pro bono basis, to map the existing. So when we are looking at from an economic point of view, we really need to look at it again as a business plan and look at what exactly is the impact of Indian art and culture in the top 50 cities based on GDP and based on Indian diaspora's presence. In terms of, for example, is there a festival of Indian art, visual arts, performing arts, music and performing arts in that city? For example, Singapore every year hosts one, right? Now, is there one in for example, in New Zealand? And if not, why not? Right? So therefore, if you look at across the verticals and then say that there are 37 restaurants in Perth, right? So you know that that's a statistic that you know. Now, the question is there a demand for more? For more restaurants, and then you classify restaurants into South Indian vegetarian restaurants and North Indian restaurants. So you can have a classification and saying, okay, there are 6 South Indian restaurants, and therefore is there a demand for 8. So once you do a mapping of these 50 cities across these verticals, in terms of cuisine, in terms of Ayurveda, in terms of visual arts, in terms of performing arts. Visual arts, for example, where does somebody who wants to buy Indian art go to? Right? There are some galleries which specialize in. Now, can we expand that? Because gallery business in India also, it's not something very, it's not a thriving. So they need intervention. Again, here the state intervention needs. So, for example, Venice Biennale or any of these large, you would have to subsidize and take a larger stall. That's the cost, and then give the opportunity for 5-6 Indian companies to present their thing. So, for example, Singapore Art Fair, where we have an annual art fair every year. So there are 6-7 Indian galleries at present. Could we increase that by negotiating? So this is a requirement to first and foremost prepare a business plan across these verticals, across 50 cities, and saying, okay, this is the current situation. There's a demand like this. In these kind of ventures, there is a demand, and therefore we can, people can realize and then try and set up those businesses. Once you have that, you go ahead. You were asking something.
No, please go ahead. I'll ask later.
Once you have this, you can have like a war room kind of a situation wherein you're actually, with real-time mapping of all the, imagine a console of, evaluate this is the impact that's happening this year. So imagine a situation wherein, for example, there's a lit fest in London, for example, and does it have? Is there a presence of an Indian author there? They are also looking for content. They are also curating and they're looking for content. And we are producing several global authors now. But again, it requires logistics and it requires travel costs, and it requires subsidizing somebody to go and make your presence there. So every festival around the world, in top music festivals, top literary festivals, all Biennales. So everything, if you just map and say, what is my current presence? And then what can be the potential presence? And then your perspective is that, okay, in order for my to reach that potential, then I need to do these kind of initiatives and interventions. So this is what is required, that you need to have a business plan. You need to have a real-time mapping of the impact on a year-on-year basis. So when I talk about saying that, look, we have to be a global soft power, we can be a global soft power by the year 2030, then we are talking about creating this business plan, creating these institutional interventions of financing and funding and these kind of a trade bodies, and then having a mapping scenario wherein year on year you can see the progress. For example, how many visitors travel to India from Cape Town? Right? We should have that data somewhere. Now, how do I increase that? Therefore, if there is an increase of travelers from that place, it means that my soft power and my presence there has increased. That's a qualitative, tangible metric. So we need to break it down. So soft power is nice and mushy and nice thing, but you have to change your perspective to think of it as economics. It's just the economics of culture.
I should apologize to our viewers and very quickly ask you a question I should have asked right at the beginning. I know this because, we've talked before, privately. The basic idea behind this whole soft power push is that Hari Kiran has come up with 12 verticals. I mean, I remember this as I was listening to you, the 12 verticals that you have created: Ayurveda, tourism, literature, art, music, yoga. The 12 verticals that have been created have been imagined at Creative India Academy. And there's financing ideas such as mudra, which refinancing and all that. Could you just please briefly explain the structure? I should have asked you this right in the beginning, and people who are not aware of it might have got a little lost. I just realized in the last answer.
No issues. So we have a platform with Swarajya. We work. There's a digital platform. One of the initiatives that we just started with is Creative India Mag. And that is basically when we looked at that, and then these 12 verticals. The first is, of course, spirituality. Then we have Ayurveda. Then we have yoga. We have handicrafts. We have visual arts. We have performing arts. We have music. We have films. We have literature. And then we have tourism. So these are the 12 verticals that, if you break it down, again, this comes back to not generalizing it into a larger theme of art and culture and soft power, but just breaking it down into specifics of various aspects of a culture. And so these are the 12 verticals that one could think of as a broader thing. And a design is one more. And so within these larger, you also have subsets. For example, Indian design is a very, very in demand. And when I said design, I'm talking about fashion, I'm talking about jewelry design, I'm talking about furniture design. So in fact, even industrial design with the Indian aesthetic sense would come there. So when you look at design, then the subcategories would be all this. And when you look at handicrafts, of course, handicrafts would have several facets of handicrafts from across the country. Cuisine again would have these subcategories. Like, for example, you have a modernistic cuisine that is very popular now. And you have so different segmentations basically within a broader theme. This is just to map it in such a way that when we talk about which state, which country, which city has a greater demand for a particular vertical. For example, there's a huge demand for Indian spirituality in South America. So in Advaita Academy, we have more than 1 lakh Facebook likes, and almost some 25 to 30,000 are from Brazil and the other countries from South America. There's some connection that we seem to have between these two countries and their response to Indian spirituality. This gives you this kind of a framework gives you to drill down into the next level, and that's what. So some countries can have some kind of a resonance. We all know about Indian cuisine having resonance in UK, but interestingly, you don't have the same kind of modernistic cuisine that you have seen in UK in the US. For some strange reason, US has not responded as much to. Typically, if you go to any Indian restaurant in US, there's a buffet, and that's it. But if you go to London, then you have all these modernist cuisine like Vinit Bhatia and all of these people who have experimented, and so you get some exclusive cuisine there. So one needs to look at which country, which market, what kind of consumer profile, and then you will understand this across these verticals. You asked me one question whether it is for non-Indians also. One of the things that we are trying to plan is to do a festival for Indic files, basically celebrating. There are so many, like you said, you know a lot of people who do Bharatanatyam, right? A lot of non-Indians who do. Now, we will celebrate them. So this festival that we're talking about for non-Indians who are, so there, I mean, if you look at it again, look at as consumers of Indian art and culture. That's like they buy a ticket and then enjoy it, or they go to Indian consumers, or they're practitioners, right? They're actually dedicating their life to learn something about, like you were saying, your teacher is a non-Indian and is learning Bharatanatyam. So they're practitioners of Indian art. Somebody learns singing, somebody learns dancing, somebody learns a musical instrument. And then you have their collectors of Indian art. So there are a lot of people who are collectors, and then people who come to India to experience. So if you look at your segmentation of consumers, you have broadly these. Now, how about a festival that is dedicated entirely to them, 3 days, and then you invite all of them, and then 10,000 people from all over the world come to India to experience it. And you're celebrating our art and culture with people and thanking them for being the brand ambassadors for our art and culture, for enjoying our art and culture. So these are things that we need to, the point is that we need to think of initiatives. We need to think of interventions which are not necessarily very grand and very big, very small interventions, and then we can make an impact.
And let me sort of, slip into geopolitics for a little bit. You are pushing Indian culture, we are pushing Indian culture. But do you think this marketplace of culture, because when Indian culture goes out there, it will, be one of, for consumers, it is one of many cultures. There's Chinese culture, there's definitely, European culture, and other cultures, Arab culture, Vietnam, some of them are stronger in cuisine, others in literature, whatever. Do you think this sort of like a marketplace of culture, and is it a zero-sum game, or do you think, or is it, are we joining a cacophony of cultures which we have not been a part of until now? And how does this translate into making dharmic culture more robust in that sense?
Well, you see, first and foremost, let's look at a matrix again. Go back to a matrix and look at different kinds of power, and look at different kinds of and who are our competitors in that sense. Look at America, look at China, look at India, look at Russia, look at Brazil, look at Japan, look at South Korea, and if you look at and map these countries across political and economic power and military power and cultural power, the sheer breadth of culture that India has, there is no other country that even comes close. So you might have K-pop from South Korea, you might have sushi from Japan, but they're all unidimensional, or they have one or two facets that they can promote. But the Indian art and culture, like I said, is across these 12 verticals. And within that, there are several sub-verticals. So therefore, just in terms of competition that we only have America as a competition. We don't have anybody else as competition in terms of just the breadth of. So to say that, to that extent, we are rightly positioned to be a global soft superpower. Therefore, that is we are probably the only country who is positioned to be a global soft superpower. The others are unidimensional, or they have one or two dimensions. They don't have the same breadth. So this is the first thing. Now, it is not a zero-sum game, and that's why when I was speaking in Goa also, I was talking about synthesis agent. We should be calling ourselves as a global synthesis agent. When we say synthesis, there's a combination, and within this combination, there's an extra that's created. So therefore, there's really no cacophony in the sense there is synthesis, and that's the second point. And third point is from a dharma point of view, if you look at what are the global mega trends that are happening in the world. One is there is this entire movement towards spirituality. Mm-hmm. And there's a movement towards consciousness studies and spirituality. That's one big trend. The second thing is about care in terms of environment, sustainable living, in terms of healthcare, in terms of healthy lifestyle. Then in terms of your yoga and meditation and mindfulness, that's one big trend. There's another big trend is craft. So everything in the world now, people are making it, whether you say craft beer, craft whiskey, craft, everything is craft. Basically, what does that mean? It communicates saying that, look, I don't like these large mega manufacturing companies. So it's a rebellion against these larger companies. But I want to encourage smaller companies. Small is beautiful. So therefore, I would buy products from people who make it in a smaller, sustainable way. So that's the big trend that is there globally. So, and of course, in terms of culture, there's a big trend towards curated experiences. So everybody wants some intellectual aspect. It's just not an emotional enjoyment or something, but they want to understand a little more and overlay an intellectual concept to enjoy that experience better. Whether it is food, whether it's a concert, whether it is a tourism visit to a particular place, there's a big trend towards overlaying the intellect over the mind from an emotion. So that is a very big trend that we need to understand. So if you look at these 5 trends, and if you look at how our dharma can also be broken into ceremonies in terms of consciousness, in terms of care, in terms of culture, we are actually responding. So Indian art and culture is responding to a global demand. And if we don't realize it, then we would be missing out an opportunity to become, using culture to become an economic powerhouse. So this is a big global demand, and we must understand and appreciate this trend and capture that and leverage it from an economic point of view.
And finally, before I close, the way I forgot to ask you to lay out the map of your plans in the beginning. Is there something else I have forgotten that you want to draw attention to specifically about Creative India Academy and this soft power initiative?
Well, I mean, the first thing is we've been going slow in terms of just to get this concept out. So the first and foremost would be to at least get this network of angels and the nice off the ground. And hopefully during the coming year, we'll also work on the festival for Indic Files. These are the initiatives that we can look at. We also just, we have Creative India Mag is now 1 year old. We have had a collaboration with Swaraja. And now we have taken a decision to make it completely long form, because what's happening is that long form reading and long form journalism and long reads is coming back. While we have these attention deficits that are happening. We also want meaningful reading and meaningful understanding. So this year would be to focus on making Creative India Mag as a very, very place to go for long form pieces on art and culture. So these are the 4 or 5 things that we want to do.
Okay, thank you, Hari, for speaking to us, and lots of luck. And anybody who's watching the Indian sphere in the world is definitely going to be in for some exciting times in the next 5 to 10 years at least. So thanks a lot, and wish you much luck.
Thank you, Jaydeep. Thank you very much.